Imagine building one of the most fearsome naval forces in human history. A fleet that launched a surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, sank battleships across the Pacific, and boasted the two largest battleships ever constructed. Now imagine watching it all disappear in the span of just a few years. That's exactly what happened to the Imperial Japanese Navy. By 1945, it was gone. But the story of how it disappeared and what rose from its ruins is one of the most dramatic military transformations of the 20th century. Today, we're diving deep into what happened to the Japanese Navy after World War II. To understand what happened after the war, we first need to understand what was left of the Japanese Navy by August 1945. The short answer: almost nothing. The Imperial Japanese Navy, or IJN, had entered the war in 1941 as one of the three most powerful naval forces on Earth, alongside the United States and Britain. It possessed cutting-edge aircraft carriers, devastatingly effective torpedo technology, and a culture of aggressive, elite seamanship that had been refined over decades. But by mid-1945, the U.S. Navy had systematically destroyed it. The Battle of Midway in June 1942 was the turning point. Japan lost 4 fleet carriers in a single engagement, and it never truly recovered. From there, a relentless campaign of attrition wore down Japan's naval aviation, its destroyer escorts, and its surface fleet. The famous Yamato, the largest battleship ever built, was sunk in April 1945 on a one-way suicide mission to Okinawa. Its sister ship, the Musashi, had been lost the previous October at the Battle of Leyte Gulf. By the time Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender on August 15, 1945, the Imperial Japanese Navy had been reduced to scattered remnants. Most of its capital ships were at the bottom of the Pacific. The remaining vessels sat idle in harbors, unable to operate for lack of fuel, spare parts, or trained crews. Japan had lost the war, and with it, it had lost its navy. When Allied occupation forces under General Douglas MacArthur arrived in Japan, one of their first priorities was ensuring that Japan could never again wage aggressive war. The Imperial Japanese Navy wasn't just defeated, it was to be abolished. This was formalized in Japan's new constitution, enacted in May 1947. Article 9, one of the most famous constitutional clauses in history, renounced war as a sovereign right of the nation and explicitly prohibited Japan from maintaining war potential. No army, no navy, no air force. At least not in the traditional sense. The remaining ships of the IJN were divided up among the Allied powers. The United States, Britain, the Soviet Union, and China each received a portion of the surviving Japanese fleet as war prizes. Most of these vessels were not in good condition. The Soviets received several destroyers and submarines. The Americans and British took others, primarily to study Japanese naval technology. Many ships were simply scrapped. Submarines were a particular concern for the Allies. Japan developed a number of technologically advanced submarines, including massive underwater aircraft carriers capable of launching attack planes. The I-400 class. The Americans were intensely curious about this technology. They captured several of these submarines, studied them extensively, and then, fearing the Soviets would demand access to inspect them under the treaty terms, deliberately scuttled them off the coast of Hawaii in 1946. The symbolism was hard to miss. The weapons of Japanese naval power were being sunk, one by one, into the same ocean where so much blood had been spilled. For a few years, it seemed like Japan would remain permanently demilitarized. Article 9 was in effect. The occupation was ongoing, and there was broad international support, and significant Japanese public support, for keeping Japan's military ambitions in check forever. Then, in June 1950, North Korea invaded South Korea. Everything changed. The United States suddenly found itself fighting a land war in Asia, and its occupation forces in Japan were needed at the front. MacArthur needed troops, and he needed them fast. That meant Japan's own security was left dangerously thin. Washington's Cold War calculus shifted overnight. A disarmed Japan was now a liability, not an asset. The Americans needed Japan as a strategic ally in the Pacific, and that meant Japan needed to be able to defend itself, at least to some degree. In 1950, MacArthur authorized the creation of the National Police Reserve, a ground force of 75,000 men that was military in all but name. 2 years later, in 1952, a maritime counterpart was established, the Coastal Safety Force. This was, in essence, the beginning of a new Japanese naval force, though nobody was allowed to call it that yet. The legal gymnastics were remarkable. Japan's constitution still banned military forces, so the government carefully reinterpreted the law. These new organizations were not an army or a navy. They were safety forces, defensive in nature, existing solely to protect Japanese territory from direct attack. Critics called it a fig leaf. Supporters called it pragmatic realism. In 1954, the legal framework was formalized with the passage of the Self-Defense Forces Law. On July 1st of that year, 3 branches came into existence: the Ground Self-Defense Force, the Air Self-Defense Force, and, most relevant for our story, the Japan Maritime Self-Defense Force, or JMSDF. It was, by any meaningful measure, a navy. It had ships, sailors, officers, and a mission to defend Japan's sea lanes. But it deliberately avoided the trappings and language of military power. There were no warships. They were defense vessels. There was no fleet in the traditional sense. Officers wore different insignia from their pre-war predecessors, and the entire force was structured around the idea of reactive defense rather than power projection. Many of the personnel who formed the JMSDF were veterans of the Imperial Japanese Navy. Their institutional knowledge, their expertise in navigation and seamanship, their understanding of tactics, all of it transferred into the new force. In a very human sense, the IJN didn't entirely disappear. It was reconstituted, quietly and carefully, behind a new name and a new legal structure. The United States actively assisted in this process. Under the Mutual Defense Assistance Agreement, American ships and equipment were transferred to Japan. U.S. Navy officers helped train JMSDF personnel. Japan was being rearmed. Cautiously, defensively, but unmistakably. In the decades that followed, the Japan Maritime Self-Defense Force grew into a highly capable and technologically sophisticated organization, one that today is regularly ranked among the top 5 naval forces in the world. This is remarkable when you consider where it started. The JMSDF developed particular expertise in anti-submarine warfare, a natural priority given Japan's dependence on sea lanes for imported oil, food, and raw materials. During the Cold War, tracking Soviet submarines in the Pacific was one of its primary missions, and it developed world-class capabilities in that area. Japan also became a major builder of its own warships, Japanese shipyards, which had built the Yamato and the Musashi, eventually shifted to producing destroyers, frigates, and submarines for the JMSDF. Today, Japan's Aegis-equipped destroyers are among the most capable surface combatants afloat. Perhaps most controversially, Japan eventually began building ships that many analysts describe as aircraft carriers, though the Japanese government carefully classifies them as helicopter destroyers or multi-purpose destroyers. The JS Izumo and its sister ship, the JS Kaga, are flat-decked vessels large enough to operate fixed-wing aircraft. In recent years, both have been modified to carry American F-35B stealth fighters. By any practical definition, these are aircraft carriers. The same type of vessel whose loss at Midway devastated the Imperial Japanese Navy 80 years ago. There is a haunting continuity in all of this. The Imperial Japanese Navy sank. The men who built it, sailed it, and died aboard its ships became a footnote in the story of Japan's catastrophic defeat. But the knowledge, the tradition, and the institutional memory didn't entirely vanish. It went underground for a few years, then resurfaced. Chastened, rebranded, but recognizably connected to what came before. The sunken ships of the IJN are, in many cases, still out there. The Yamato lies at the bottom of the East China Sea, roughly 340 meters down. The Musashi was located by Microsoft co-founder Paul Allen in 2015, lying in the Sibuyan Sea. Hundreds of other wrecks dot the Pacific, from Guadalcanal to Truk Lagoon to the Philippines. They are war graves, and the Japanese government and veterans groups have worked for decades to memorialize and respect them. The stories of individual sailors are equally complex. Thousands of men served aboard vessels that were lost at sea. Thousands more survived and had to rebuild their lives in a Japan that had renounced the military culture they'd grown up in. Some veterans became vocal pacifists. Others quietly resumed naval careers in the JMSDF. A few became advocates for preserving the history and memory of the ships they'd served on. Today, Japan is at a crossroads that would have been unimaginable in 1945, facing a resurgent China, an unpredictable North Korea, and questions about the long-term reliability of American security guarantees. Japan has been steadily expanding its military capabilities. In December 2022, the Japanese government released a new national security strategy that explicitly described Japan as moving toward a counterstrike capability, the ability to strike enemy missile bases on foreign soil. This is a dramatic departure from 7 decades of purely defensive posture. The JMSDF's budget has increased significantly. New destroyer acquisitions, submarine programs, and the ongoing conversion of the Izumo-class ships to carrier capability all point toward a Japan that is cautiously, carefully, but unmistakably expanding its naval power. Article 9 still exists in the Constitution, but the interpretation of what it permits has been stretched far beyond what its authors intended. Japan has not abandoned pacifism. Public opinion still strongly supports a restrained military posture. But the hard realities of 21st century geopolitics are pulling the country in a different direction. The story of the Japanese Navy after World War II is ultimately a story about transformation. From imperial aggressor to occupied nation, from occupied nation to reluctant ally, from reluctant ally to cautious regional power. The ships are different, the uniforms are different, the name is different. But somewhere in the DNA of the Japan Maritime Self-Defense Force, there is a thread that connects back to the men who sailed the Yamato, who launched planes from the decks of fleet carriers at Pearl Harbor, and who were ultimately consumed by a war their nation started and could not finish. History rarely ends cleanly. Empires don't simply vanish. They transform. And the Japanese Navy, in its own complicated way, is proof of that. If you found this video interesting, consider subscribing for more deep dives into military history. And if you want to learn more about the Pacific War, check out our other videos on the Battle of Midway and the fall of the IJN's carrier fleet. See you next time.